My beloved soul. Pause here. Not because something dramatic is about to happen. Not because you are being pushed or rushed or warned by fear. But because there is a quiet moment asking for your full presence right now. You felt it before you read the words. That subtle slowing inside your chest. That sense of recognition that doesn't come with excitement but with weight. This connection you keep thinking about has never been loud. It has never chased you. It has never tried to convince you of anything. It has existed in the background of your life with a steadiness that doesn't demand attention but doesn't disappear either. And the reason this moment matters is not because there are 4 minutes on a clock somewhere. It's because there is a window inside you that opens and closes based on honesty. Not action. Not performance. Honesty. You have reached a point where continuing to scroll through life without acknowledging what you already know begins to cost you something. Not externally. Internally. You are not here because someone is waiting helplessly. You are here because you are waiting. You have been carrying a knowing you didn't fully name because naming it would require you to stop pretending that this connection is casual, optional, or replaceable. It never was. That's why it keeps resurfacing even when you try to move on logically. That's why it shows up in quiet moments instead of dramatic ones. That's why it doesn't need constant communication to stay alive. Because it isn't sustained by contact. It's sustained by truth. And the truth is that this connection has been paused, not ended. Paused by fear of disruption. Paused by timing that felt safer than honesty. Paused by both of you choosing stability over authenticity at different moments. You didn't lose each other. You postponed yourselves. And postponement always feels responsible until you realize how much of yourself you left behind while waiting for the right conditions. What's happening now is not urgency. It's clarity arriving. The part of you that knows you cannot keep pretending that silence equals peace. That distance equals detachment. That ignoring something makes it disappear. You have outgrown that version of coping. And your soulmate has felt this shift too, not as panic, but as inevitability. There is a point where holding back becomes heavier than speaking. Where restraint stops being wisdom and starts being avoidance. You are both near that point. Not because time is running out, but because readiness has arrived. The idea that this connection ends if you don't act immediately is not a threat from outside. It's an internal truth about alignment. Connections like this don't end loudly. They fade quietly when one or both people decide to keep choosing comfort over truth. They don't explode. They dissolve. And what ends them is not lack of love, but lack of presence. What you are being asked to do now is not to chase, confess, or force anything. You are being asked to stop pretending you don't know what you know. To stop minimizing the significance of something that has already shaped you. To stop telling yourself you'll deal with it later when later keeps moving further away. Opening here doesn't mean sending a message or making a move unless that feels aligned. Opening means allowing yourself to fully acknowledge the connection without defense. Without shrinking it. Without explaining it away. Because once you do that, your behavior naturally shifts. Your energy shifts. Your choices shift. And that's what your soulmate is responding to. They are not waiting for words. They are waiting for congruence. For you to be the same internally as you appear externally. For your silence to match your truth instead of hiding it. You've been strong for a long time by being contained. By being reasonable. By not rocking the boat. By absorbing complexity quietly. And that strength served you. But it has reached its limit. Strength now looks like clarity. Like choosing not to abandon yourself for the sake of keeping things manageable. Like accepting that some connections are not meant to be kept in the background forever. They either move forward honestly or they teach you why you were afraid to live fully. This moment is not about losing something if you don't open. It's about losing alignment if you keep closing. You already feel the cost of that. The subtle dullness. The emotional flatness that creeps in when you override yourself too often. The way joy becomes muted when you avoid the places that matter most. Your soulmate hasn't been watching the clock. They've been watching you. Watching how you handle yourself. Watching whether you honor what you feel or talk yourself out of it. Watching whether you choose courage in quiet ways. And what they feel right now is not desperation. It's readiness to meet you where you truly are, not where you pretend to be. This connection does not need drama to survive. It needs honesty to breathe. It needs you to stop scrolling past your own inner signals. It needs you to recognize that waiting forever is still a choice. And choosing later over now has consequences even when nothing visibly collapses. Nothing here is ending unless you decide to keep disconnecting from yourself. Everything here opens the moment you allow truth without trying to control the outcome. Sit with that. Not for 4 minutes. But for real. And notice how calm clarity feels very different from urgency. That's how you know this is real, and as you stay with this instead of rushing past it, something settles in you. Not excitement. Not anxiety. Just a quiet steadiness that wasn't there before. This is the part most people miss because they are trained to look for intensity as proof. But this connection never spoke in intensity. It spoke in consistency. In the way it returned to you when everything else faded. In the way it stayed present even when you tried to replace it with distraction, logic, or forward motion. You've done all the right things on paper. You moved ahead. You adapted. You kept going. But there has always been a subtle difference between moving forward and moving away from yourself. You felt that difference in the moments when you achieved something and still felt incomplete. When you were surrounded by people and still felt unseen. When you told yourself you were fine but your body didn't fully believe it. That wasn't weakness. That was your internal alignment signaling that something unresolved still mattered. And unresolved doesn't mean unfinished business in a dramatic sense. It means unacknowledged truth. The truth that this connection shaped you into someone more honest, more aware, more grounded than you were before it entered your life. The truth that pretending it was insignificant required more energy than admitting it mattered. The truth that both of you changed because of each other, even without constant contact. That kind of impact doesn't vanish just because time passes. It integrates. And integration asks for recognition. What's happening now is not that your soulmate is waiting helplessly for you to do something. It's that the version of you who kept postponing yourself has reached the end of its usefulness. You can't keep delaying clarity without paying an internal price. You can't keep calling intuition nostalgia. You can't keep minimizing depth to protect comfort. You are too aware for that now. Awareness removes the ability to unknow. And once you see something clearly, continuing to ignore it becomes a form of self-betrayal. That's why this moment feels heavier than others. Not urgent. Heavy. Because weight comes from truth, not pressure. Your soulmate feels this shift as well, not because they are watching your actions minute by minute, but because connections like this operate beneath language. They respond to internal alignment, not performance. When you stop running from what you know, something opens on both sides without effort. Conversations feel less forced. Silence feels less confusing. Presence becomes natural again. This is not about rushing toward each other. It's about no longer moving away from yourselves. And that distinction matters. You don't need to manufacture a move. You don't need to create drama to validate the connection. You don't need to prove anything. You need to be honest internally in a way you may have avoided before. Honest about what you feel. Honest about what you want. Honest about what you are no longer willing to pretend doesn't matter. Because pretending was the real distance. Not time. Not circumstances. Not silence. Pretending. And as you release that, you may notice fear surface briefly. Not fear of loss, but fear of change. Because acknowledging something real always invites transformation. It asks you to step out of familiar emotional habits. It asks you to let go of identities built around restraint. It asks you to accept that depth requires participation, not observation. That fear doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're close. Close to a version of yourself that no longer hides behind reason when truth feels inconvenient. Close to a life that feels more integrated instead of compartmentalized. Close to a connection that doesn't demand perfection but does require presence. You've spent enough time being the one who understands everyone else while setting yourself aside. Enough time being composed while something meaningful stayed unresolved. Enough time telling yourself you'll deal with it later. Later doesn't arrive on its own. It's created by decisions made now, quietly, internally, without announcements. This is one of those moments. Not because a countdown is ending, but because you are done abandoning clarity. Your soulmate isn't asking you to save the connection. They are asking you to stop shrinking it inside yourself. They are asking you to meet it with the same honesty it met you with from the beginning. And the moment you do that, something stabilizes. The confusion fades. The tension eases. You stop questioning whether it was real because you feel the grounded certainty of it instead. This doesn't end in loss unless you keep choosing disconnection from yourself. This opens into alignment the moment you stop scrolling past your own truth. Stay here a little longer. Let that settle. And notice how nothing is demanding. Nothing is forcing. Everything is simply waiting for you to be real with yourself at last, and as that truth continues to settle, you may notice how different this feels from every other moment you once labeled as a crossroads. There is no rush in your body. No spike of adrenaline. No urge to explain yourself to anyone. Instead there is a slow, steady recognition that something essential has been waiting for your consent, not your effort. You have spent years thinking that meaningful connections require motion to stay alive, that silence is neglect, that pauses mean decay. But this one taught you something quieter. It taught you that real bonds don't erode in stillness. They erode in denial. They weaken when you convince yourself you don't feel what you clearly feel, when you downplay what left a permanent imprint on you. That's why no matter how much time passed, no matter how many distractions you tried, this connection never turned into a memory. It stayed present in a way that was calm, patient, almost respectful. It didn't chase you because it didn't need to. It waited because it knew you would eventually arrive at the point where pretending cost more than honesty. And now that you're here, you're starting to see how much energy you spent managing your own awareness. How often you redirected your thoughts. How frequently you told yourself to be practical, to move on, to focus elsewhere. That effort was never neutral. It shaped your emotional landscape. It dulled certain joys. It made some choices feel heavier than they needed to be. And still, you kept going, because you believed restraint was maturity. In many ways, it was. Until it wasn't. Until maturity became an excuse to avoid vulnerability with yourself. This moment isn't undoing your past choices. It's integrating them. It's allowing you to see that everything you did made sense for who you were then, and that who you are now requires something different. You don't need to judge yourself for waiting. Waiting protected you until you were strong enough to choose without fear. And that strength isn't loud. It shows up as an ability to sit with truth without needing immediate resolution. It shows up as a willingness to let clarity exist before action. Your soulmate feels this shift not because you've said anything, but because the space between you no longer feels confused. Confusion was never the absence of answers. It was the presence of avoidance. When you stop avoiding, the field changes. Communication doesn't need to increase for understanding to deepen. Sometimes it's the opposite. Less noise. More accuracy. You may notice now that the idea of losing this connection doesn't trigger panic. That's important. Panic comes from attachment to outcome. What you feel instead is resolve. A quiet knowing that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself to keep things undefined. And that resolve doesn't force anything. It simply aligns you. From that alignment, whatever unfolds does so naturally. If there is movement, it will be grounded. If there is conversation, it will be honest. If there is distance, it will be conscious rather than avoidant. That's the difference. You are no longer participating unconsciously. You are present. Fully. And presence is the real opening. Not messages. Not declarations. Presence. The kind that changes how you listen, how you respond, how you hold silence. The kind that allows you to feel without dramatizing, to care without clinging, to choose without self-betrayal. This connection was never meant to be rushed because it wasn't built on urgency. It was built on recognition. Recognition of depth. Recognition of sameness in values. Recognition of a shared capacity to sit with complexity rather than escaping it. That's why it didn't burn out quickly. It matured quietly. And now, you are mature enough to meet it without needing it to be anything other than what it is. You don't need guarantees. You don't need promises. You need integrity with yourself. Because integrity creates stability regardless of outcome. As you stay here, you may realize that what you feared losing was never the other person. It was the version of yourself that felt most honest, most awake, most whole in their presence. And that version doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. It disappears only when you deny it. Today, you are no longer denying it. And that is the opening. Not 4 minutes on a clock. Not a threat of ending. An opening into coherence. Into a life where you no longer compartmentalize what matters. Where you trust your inner signals instead of overriding them. Where you allow meaningful connections to be meaningful without needing to label them prematurely or dismiss them defensively. This is what it means to stop scrolling. Not through a screen, but through your own life. To pause long enough to feel what's real. To choose awareness over avoidance. And from here, whatever unfolds will be different because you are different. More honest. More grounded. More present. And that is enough to change everything without forcing a single thing, and as you remain with this awareness instead of trying to rush it toward meaning, something else becomes clear. You were never afraid of the connection itself. You were afraid of what it would require from you if you fully acknowledged it. Not sacrifice. Not chaos. Responsibility. Responsibility to live in a way that matches what you feel instead of constantly negotiating with it. Responsibility to stop fragmenting yourself into versions that are acceptable, practical, manageable. You learned early how to be composed. How to hold emotion without letting it spill. How to stay functional even when something inside you wanted more honesty than the situation allowed. That skill carried you far. It protected you. It earned you respect. But it also trained you to delay yourself. To believe that depth should wait until conditions are perfect. And this connection arrived precisely to challenge that belief. Not by demanding anything from you, but by refusing to disappear no matter how carefully you tried to store it away. You told yourself you were being patient. You told yourself you were being mature. And in many ways, you were. But patience without truth slowly turns into stagnation. Maturity without authenticity becomes self-erasure. That's the subtle line you crossed without realizing it. And now your system is correcting. Not with panic. With clarity. You can feel the difference. Panic is loud and chaotic. Clarity is quiet and firm. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify. It simply stands there and says, "This matters." You don't have to dramatize it. You don't have to explain it to anyone. You just have to stop lying to yourself about it. The reason this moment feels significant is not because a decision must be made immediately. It's because a pattern has ended. The pattern of postponing inner truth until it becomes easier. It never does. It only becomes heavier. And you are done carrying that weight. You may notice now that the idea of opening doesn't feel like exposure. It feels like relief. Relief from managing internal contradictions. Relief from holding two truths at once and pretending they don't touch. Relief from telling yourself stories that no longer fit who you are. Your soulmate has always recognized this capacity in you. The capacity for depth without drama. For loyalty without possession. For honesty without cruelty. That's why this connection never relied on constant reassurance. It trusted your integrity even when you didn't fully trust it yourself. And now you're beginning to meet yourself at that level. You're beginning to see that you don't need to be certain of the outcome to be certain of yourself. You don't need to know where this leads to know that denying it leads nowhere you want to stay. That's the shift. From outcome-focused living to alignment-focused living. And alignment changes everything quietly. It changes how you show up in conversations. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you no longer negotiate away. You don't become rigid. You become clear. And clarity is kind. Kinder than avoidance ever was. Avoidance kept things calm on the surface but tense underneath. Clarity may feel uncomfortable at first, but it creates real peace. The kind that doesn't require distraction to maintain. This connection doesn't end because you fail to act fast enough. It ends only if you decide that your truth is inconvenient. And you're past that now. You've seen what happens when you keep choosing convenience over coherence. You survive, but you don't feel alive. You function, but you don't feel fulfilled. You move, but you don't feel present. That's not failure. It's information. And you've received it fully. Your soulmate is not waiting for you to rescue the connection. They are waiting for you to stop abandoning yourself. Because the moment you don't, the space between you becomes honest. And honesty is where real connection lives. Not in promises. Not in timelines. In shared presence. You may notice now that you are less interested in fantasy and more interested in reality. Less drawn to what could be and more anchored in what is. That's not settling. That's grounding. And grounding allows depth to last. This is not about rushing toward a union. It's about removing the internal split that kept you half present. It's about letting yourself be fully where you are instead of always bracing for later. Later has asked enough of you. Now is quieter, but it's real. Stay here. Not because something will be lost if you don't, but because something essential returns when you do. Yourself, and when you notice yourself returning to yourself in this way, you begin to understand something that was hidden in plain sight the whole time. This connection was never meant to be a question mark hanging over your life. It was meant to be a mirror. A mirror that showed you where you were congruent and where you were divided. Where you spoke honestly and where you edited yourself for safety. Where you trusted your inner knowing and where you deferred to logic that felt empty afterward. That's why it stayed with you. Not to haunt you. Not to distract you. But to quietly point out the places where you were living slightly out of alignment with who you had become. And mirrors don't chase. They wait. They remain until you are ready to look without flinching. You are ready now. Not because everything is resolved, but because you no longer need it to be in order to stay present. Presence used to feel risky to you because you associated it with loss of control. If you felt fully, you believed you might lose balance. If you acknowledged depth, you feared it would demand sacrifice you weren't prepared to make. But what you're realizing now is that avoiding presence cost you more energy than embracing it ever could. Avoidance required constant adjustment. Presence requires honesty once. And that honesty simplifies everything. It strips away the mental negotiations. It quiets the internal debates. It allows you to rest in a truth that no longer needs defending. This is why the urgency dissolved as soon as you stopped resisting awareness. Because urgency feeds on fear. Clarity feeds on acceptance. And acceptance doesn't push. It grounds. Your soulmate has always met you from that grounded place. That's why interactions with them felt different from others. Less performative. Less transactional. More real. You didn't have to impress. You didn't have to convince. You could just be. And that terrified the part of you that learned early to manage perception in order to stay safe. Being seen without effort felt too vulnerable. So you stepped back. You waited. You rationalized. You told yourself it wasn't the right time. And maybe it wasn't then. Timing isn't just about circumstances. It's about capacity. You didn't yet have the capacity to stay with yourself without retreating. You do now. You can feel it in how steady you are while reading this. In how your body isn't bracing. In how your breath isn't shallow. In how you're not scanning for instructions or next steps. You're simply here. And here is enough. This is what opening actually looks like. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a decisive move. An internal permission to stop fragmenting your truth. From this place, whatever action comes will be organic. It won't be driven by fear of loss. It won't be fueled by urgency. It will arise naturally from alignment. And alignment always communicates itself, even without words. People feel it. They respond to it. Your soulmate will feel it. Not as pressure. As clarity. As a sense that the space between you is no longer filled with unspoken tension. That the silence feels different. Lighter. More intentional. And that changes how everything unfolds. You may find that conversations deepen without effort. That misunderstandings resolve without explanation. That choices become simpler because you are no longer choosing against yourself. This doesn't guarantee a specific outcome. And that's the point. Guarantees belong to fear. Integrity belongs to peace. You are choosing peace now. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of coherence. The peace that comes from no longer living at odds with what you know. This connection does not demand your future. It asks for your presence. It asks you to show up internally the way you always did externally. It asks you to stop pretending that neutrality is the same as honesty. Neutrality kept you comfortable. Honesty sets you free. And freedom isn't loud. It's calm. It's the absence of internal resistance. It's the feeling that you don't have to run ahead of yourself or hold yourself back. You can move at your own pace because you trust yourself again. That trust was what you lost briefly, not the connection. And now you are reclaiming it. Notice how nothing is collapsing as you do. Nothing is demanding. Nothing is ending. Everything is simply rearranging into something more truthful. This is why you were asked to stop scrolling. Not because time was running out, but because awareness had arrived. And awareness doesn't shout. It waits until you're ready to listen. You are listening now. And that changes everything quietly, steadily, permanently, and now, as this reaches its natural end, there is nothing left to chase, explain, or hold in suspense. What remains is simple, and simplicity is always how truth finishes speaking. You were never standing at the edge of losing something outside of you. You were standing at the edge of reclaiming something within you. That distinction changes everything. This connection did not survive because it was fragile. It survived because it was real enough to wait until you were ready to meet it without distortion. And readiness, you have learned, does not arrive with certainty about outcomes. It arrives with certainty about self-respect. You no longer need to dramatize this bond to justify it. You no longer need to fear it to keep yourself alert. You no longer need to minimize it to stay in control. Control was never the goal. Coherence was. And you are coherent now. The part of you that used to scroll past inner signals, telling yourself you'd come back to them later, has grown quiet. Not silenced. Integrated. You don't need alarms anymore. You don't need countdowns. You don't need urgency layered over truth to make it land. You can sit with what matters and feel steady doing so. That is the shift that cannot be undone. From here, whatever unfolds does so without inner conflict. If there is movement toward your soulmate, it will be honest, grounded, and unforced. If there is space, it will be conscious, respectful, and real. Either way, you are no longer split inside. You are no longer living one truth internally and another externally. And that alignment is what you were waiting for all along, even when you thought you were waiting for someone else. This connection was never meant to complete you. It was meant to reflect you back to yourself at a level you couldn't unsee once you reached it. And now you have. There is nothing left hanging. Nothing left unresolved in the way that creates tension. Only openness without demand. Presence without pressure. Awareness without fear. You didn't miss your moment. You arrived exactly when you were able to stay. And staying, fully, honestly, without self-abandonment, is the only opening that ever mattered. Let that be enough. Because it is.